say that later.
I'm gonna start the recording just so everyone's clear.
Okay.
Thanks for the warning.
Looks like
Recording in progress.
light attention, a light attendance so far.
Maybe both.
So nice to have you at the community. Okay, it is 7 o'clock. Why don't we get started with introductions? Welcome everybody to the Zoning and Planning Committee meeting, regular meeting on Monday, April 10th. And I am Deb Crossley, chair of the committee, and Councilor at Large from Ward 5. I'm joined by Vice Chair Vic Danberg, Councilor at Large from Ward 6, Councilor at Large from Ward 3, Pam Wright, at large from Ward 4, Josh Princeman, President Susan Albright at large from Ward 2, and Allison Leary at large from Ward 1. That's who's at the table on the committee. I don't see another committee member yet. So I see we're also joined by Councilor Rick Lipoff, chair of the Land Use Committee, and Councilor Mark Rodrigo, and Councilor Tariq. And we have sort of multiple audio going on here. So, and I also see Councilor Tariq Lucas is with us. Staff joining us this evening, Jen Kyra, Deputy Director with the Planning and Development Department, and Zachary Lamel, Chief of Long Range Planning. Got that, right? And our committee clerk is Jacqueline Norton, who's with us as well. And I believe we're also joined by Amanda Berman from the department, from the Housing Division. And is Mr. Heath going to be joining us this evening? Okay. I don't believe I see anyone from the Planning and Development Board tonight. I do see Kevin McCormick is just coming in, but I tell you what is, let me know if they come in, because I always like to introduce the Planning and Development Board, and of course we invite them into our conversation, particularly when we get development. Maria and Councilor Maria Greenberg just joined us. So that's it for introductions at the beginning of the show here tonight. We have 2 items before us. We're going to begin with an item we take up annually. And our job is to vote to authorize its submission. And then the rest of the meeting, the bulk of the meeting will be zoning redesign as usual. So item number 1 is 93-23. For honor the mayor requesting the city council authorize pursuant to the 2020 revised citizen participation plan to submit the FY 2024 annual action plan to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for CDBG, ESG, and funds, and the West Metro Home Consortium. So again, we're joined by Amanda Berman, who will walk us through the plan. I hope you all have had a chance to take a look. I'm sure you've prepared your presentation, Ms. Berman, but in reading the plan, I was most interested, just as an aside, in the barriers you identified to housing development and what we're doing about it, and what our consortium communities are doing about it. Particularly interested in what Brookline is doing. I think it bears relevance to what we're trying to do. So with that little bit of introduction, if you could please go ahead.
Sure. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good to see you. I assume you can see my screen. Okay, great. So we are here tonight, or I'm here tonight to talk about the draft FY24 annual action plan. We held the public hearing last Monday with the Planning and Development Board and are here tonight to present the plan to you all before having the public comment period close out in a couple weeks and having the mayor review and approve the final plan before submission to HUD. Here's just an overview of the timeline for the annual action plan. It follows a very similar trajectory every year, with the plan development beginning in December of the previous calendar year, advisory committee meetings and consultations starting at that time through also January and February. Like I said, last week, we held the public hearing on the draft plan with the Planning and Development Board. And that night also kicked off the public comment period, which goes through May 2nd. On May 10th, we would have the mayor review and approve the final plan before submission to HUD on May 15th, with the program year beginning July 1st of 2023. So the allocation of funds across the three different grants from HUD, the Community Development Block Grant this year, we're looking at about $1.8 million. Home Investment Partnerships Program for the entire 13 community West Metro Home Consortium is about 1.6 million. And then our Emergency Solutions Grant is approximately $164,000. Of the total 1.6 home allocation, Newton is anticipated to receive approximately $145,000 in entitlement funds. And it's just interesting to note that there's been a very slight decrease in both CDBG and ESG from FY23 and about a 2% increase in the home program fundings from FY23. This slide hasn't changed for quite a while, but you can see the allocation breakout of our CDBG funds, about 60% going towards affordable housing programs, the 15% maximum going towards human service programs, 5% towards architectural access, and 20% towards program administration. So jumping into a quick overview of the goals and activities of FY24. The first being affordable housing, to create, preserve, and rehabilitate safe, decent, and affordable rental and ownership housing, and to provide financial support to income-eligible first-time home buyers. The second is fair housing, of course, a very critical goal across all of our programs. And the real focus in FY24 is continued collaboration with both the Fair Housing Committee as well as the other home consortium communities to increase knowledge about fair housing laws and obligations. We continue to implement the FY21 to 25 analysis of impediments to fair housing report. And we are very excited that in the coming, we have officially launched a 2-year fair housing testing program throughout the 13 consortium communities with Suffolk Law Center's Housing Discrimination Testing Program. So this is something that was identified as a recommendation in the analysis of impediments report, and we're really happy that it's finally up and running for a 2-year program. And then also looking at potential policy changes across the consortium communities related to the MAPC parking utilization study. Our human services program, as I mentioned, utilizes the cap amount of 15% of our annual entitlement funds for CDBG. And these programs go to support, provide financial support for projects that directly provide stability across the lifespan for Newton's low to moderate income population. We do this by putting out an annual request for proposals to our nonprofit community. And as you can see on the screen, these are the 15 agencies that applied for funding and the recommended funding allocation for FY24. programs like the West Suburban YMCA's childcare after school program, after school and preschool, financial aid for that program. The second step is a domestic violence support service provider, as well as shelter, family access of Newton, the Boys and Girls Club, Jewish Big Brother and Big Sisters, the Cousins Fund, Pathway to Possible. We are funding a part-time clinical social worker. So you can see the programs really kind of run a broad gamut of supporting Newton's low to moderate income population across the lifespan, but then also supporting presumed eligible populations such as domestic violence survivors and those who are seniors and also those who are disabled. The next goal is related to our Emergency Solutions Grant, supportive services for homeless individuals and families and those at risk of homelessness. And this program also operates through an annual RFP process to provide supportive services for individuals and families that are homeless or are at risk of homelessness. And that includes financial support, and also supporting existing emergency and transitional housing, as well as case management that comes around all of those different programs. This table shows the breakout of the funding allocation. You can see that we are proposing to fund 3 different programs through the Emergency Shelter Services, the Community Day Center in Waltham, Reach Beyond Domestic Violence, and the Second Step. And then Brookline Community Mental Health Center is the only organization this year that is providing homelessness prevention services as well as rapid rehousing services. And then finally, our administration line item. Architectural access is where we support projects in partnership with the Commission on Disability and do that through the removal of material and architectural barriers that restrict mobility and accessibility of elderly and severely disabled persons. And that's through improvements related to public thoroughfares, public buildings, parks, recreational facilities, and at nonprofit agencies. And for FY24, the Commission on Disability voted to support exterior access improvements at City Hall, and the remaining funds will be set aside to go to a future project that will support improvements for greater architectural access. The West Metro Home Consortium, Newton is the lead entity for those 13 communities that make up the consortium, and the home program is primarily focused on creating affordable housing and rehabilitating existing affordable housing, as well as providing tenant-based rental assistance to income-eligible households. You can see kind of the 3 buckets of goals across the program year include rehab, production, and TBRA, and just kind of a small sampling of some of the projects that are going on across the consortium, from Brookline to Waltham. Wayland even has a small project this year. And then really robust tenant-based rental assistance programs in Framingham and Waltham in particular. And across the consortium, we estimate serving approximately 30 households in the coming year through TBRA. Many of you are familiar with the Home ARP funding that the consortium was awarded, approximately $5.4 million. And we just recently submitted the Home ARP allocation plan to HUD at the end of March. So we will now wait over the next 2 months to hear back from HUD as to whether or not they've accepted our plan. Once the plan is accepted, we will put out a series of RFPs. And what the plan laid out was allocating that $5.4 million in these different areas listed at the bottom of the slide, 47% of that money to go towards the development of new affordable rental housing, but specifically to support qualifying populations. And for the Home ARP program, that has been defined broadly as for those who are experiencing homelessness or those who are at risk of homelessness. So the money is really geared towards serving the lowest income population across the consortium. Again, those who are homeless or are close to potentially experiencing homelessness. 18% of the funds to be allocated towards the acquisition and development of a non-congregate shelter or shelters. 14% towards supportive services. It could be case management, programs like the ESG, homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, but really anything that qualifies under the Home ARP program as supportive services for these particular income eligible populations. And then 6% of the funding towards tenant-based rental assistance. And then finally, 15% of the program towards administration costs. So as Chair Crossley mentioned, that tonight we are looking for the vote to authorize the mayor to submit the plan to receive the funding through these three programs, CDBG, Home, and ESG. And lastly, just a reminder that the public comment period is open through May 2nd. All comments can be sent to me in written form via email or in the mail. And again, we will accept those through Tuesday, May 2nd. And that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Berman. Before we take questions, I wonder if you could touch on some of the barriers. You have a section on barriers, and it's probably a repeat section, but you have new information in there about what some of our, if you will, sister communities are doing alongside what we're trying to do here to make housing development easier. And I wonder if you could just speak to that. I was particularly interested in what Brookline is doing. You mentioned the MBTA communities requirement as part of what they're doing. You actually didn't mention it as part of what we're doing. It's, you know, in the same vein.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the communities, and I know Jen and Zach have been in close contact with Brookline and some of our other consortium communities about MBTA, but are looking very deeply at the MBTA program and how that is going to translate into greater affordability. But just continuing at the same time to look at creative ways to use both home dollars or CDBG dollars for those who have access to it, or CPA dollars, housing trust funds, considering potentially new linkage fees. So I think that there are a lot of good ideas and good movement out there to try to overcome these barriers. But I know, again, as you mentioned, a lot of the communities are heavily focused on MBTA and just thinking about zoning amendments in support of housing development, particularly for affordable housing. I think, you know, at the consortium level, we talk a lot about the education and kind of trying to further an understanding of fair housing and affordable housing and the challenges of permitting housing development. But I can't say I've heard recently of any kind of big aha moments, but I think that, you know, there is a stronger kind of regional push, and that's helpful in terms of kind of overcoming some challenges as it relates to housing development.
Okay, thank you, because that section begins by saying that the number one barrier is zoning in Massachusetts. So we're trying. Anyway,
Yeah.
I think I saw Councilor Danberg, and then Wright, and then Paul Wright.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Ms. Berman, for this very good presentation. It's always good to hear from you, and we haven't heard for a while. as to where we are in our affordable housing striving. A couple of questions. Why did the CDBG funds go down? Is this something that across the board, all the communities are experiencing, or did Newton's funds suffer more than other communities, and if so, why?
No, it's across the board. So it's Congress votes on the allocation, and so every CDBG program across the country saw that decrease, or every home program across the country saw that increase. So yeah, it's thankfully not too large of a decrease, but any decrease is concerning.
And the first time home buyers program, assistance program, what is the total dollar amount on that? And how many families do you think that dollar amount can serve?
So we estimate about 3 households on an annual basis, and it's a $10,000 grant per household. So those who are eligible are first-time home buyers who are at or below 80% of the area median income, who are purchasing a deed-restricted affordable ownership unit. So that happens when either there's a resale of an existing affordable ownership unit, and in the city there's about 80 or so of existing affordable ownership units, deed restricted, or when a new construction unit comes online and is sold for the first time. So honestly, in the last year and a half, it's been quite busy because there's been a lot of resales when the market was so hot. Homeowners who were in existing affordable units for a while, a handful of them sold, and as far as we know, moved on to buy market rate units, not in Newton, but they did move on to buy a new market rate unit. So the deed restricted affordable unit then becomes up for resale and has to go to another income eligible buyer, but it must be a first time home buyer. And so they become eligible for the grant.
Thank you. This is a great program because if people are able to own a deed restricted unit for a while and then go on to build up a little bit of capital and then go on to get into the market themselves, this is a huge success that's coming out of this program. The $300,000 in ARP funds for the tenant-based rental assistance, how many families or individuals can this $300,000 assist on an average?
Off the top of my head, I want to say we estimated about 24 households. I can double check that number while we're talking, but I think we looked at the TBRA programs that are happening now kind of over the last year or so to get an average per household to see how many could be potentially served by that number. And I want to say it's about 24, but I will look it up as we're talking.
That's actually close enough for me. If anyone else wants an exact number, that's something else. But I wondered if it was 5 or 10 or 20 or where ballpark we are. Thank you very much. That's all I have to ask. Thank you again for this very nice presentation.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wright.
Thank you. And thank you, Ms. Berman, for this detailed document here. I have a few just for the most part general questions, a little bit more from my understanding. On page 8, it talks about the West Metro Home Consortium communities are subject to a 12-month exclusive use period for their annual entitlement of home funds. And if it's not committed after 12 months, it goes transfer into the pool. So I was wondering how often don't we use all the funds or allocate them in the 12 months on how much does go back into the pool? And do we ever get money from the pool for projects?
I assume by we, you mean Newton?
Newton, yes.
Okay. I want to say in the time that I've been here, we've given our funds up 1 year. Blanking on the year, maybe FY 21. Other than that, we have had projects that have utilized our home funds. But Newton has benefited greatly from the consolidated pool. So on an annual basis, we pool together those monies, as you mentioned, from communities that don't have a specific project to award the funds to. And I would say it averages at about $300,000 a year in terms of the pool. And we put out an RFP. So I can think of the 236 Auburn Street project received a lot of money from that consolidated pool. The Coleman House Preservation Project received a large amount from the consolidated pool, as did the Armory project here in Newton. So Newton's probably been the biggest, if not one of the biggest beneficiaries of the consolidated pool funding over the last 6 years.
Great. On page 39, it talks about the production of new affordable housing units and about Golden Mayer House expansion, development of the Hayward House and the Armory. Is there anything else on the horizon?
Well, so those are projects that utilize or are utilizing CDBG or home funding. That's why they're in this plan specifically. But on the horizon, the Armory, did you mention the Armory? I'm sorry. There's the Armory, but then also, we are allocating and will continue to allocate a lot of funds towards rehabilitation of existing rental units through the Newton Housing Authority or other owners of existing affordable housing across the city. Right now, there is not a new project on the horizon, but hoping that things will change at any moment. And, we're out there always kind of drumming up support and interest in developing affordable housing in Newton. But at this moment, there isn't a large new project that I can speak of.
Good. And you sort of answered my next question was in preservation or rehabbing, we do the rentals, but we also do the owner units too for rehab.
So part of our rehab program is rehabbing single family homes single family homeowners who are income eligible can apply and benefit from the program. So I would say about $100,000 a year is set aside for that program. And the scope of work can average anywhere from 25,000 to 50 to 75,000. It really depends on the level of work that needs to be done in a home. And that is a loan that is given to the homeowner. So the homeowners, are cognizant of the fact that they will have to pay the money back. So it just depends on the particular homeowner's situation and the state of their home and the amount of repairs that need to be done.
Okay, thank you. Just two more questions. Page 80, it was talking about the lead-based paint program, which sounds like a great program, which I was not very familiar with. And it talks about it's marketed to income eligible homeowners or landlords. Are the landlords have to be income eligible? With more than 50% income eligible tenants to ensure suitable, safe living conditions.
So that's the answer, that at least 51% of the units in in the building, in the project, have to be occupied by low to moderate income households in order for that landlord to qualify to receive the funding support.
Okay, and if, let's say you just have a 2-family or 3-family, let's say 3-family. And if you have section 8, you have 2 section 8 tenants, would that qualify too for that landlord?
We would really be likely looking for, to be honest, we're not presented with that question very often. If something like that were to come before us, we would likely want to see if the units were deed restricted, because otherwise there's not really an assurance that the money is going to continue to support a low to moderate income household. So that would likely be a case by case basis, but really it's, I'm drawing I think there's been one time over the past couple of years where a owner of a 2-family approached us, but he was not able to prove that he lived in one unit and he was not able to prove that the tenant was in fact low to moderate income. So we didn't qualify him obviously for the program, but we'd have to really think about that if we were presented with a question.
So do the people, the landlords have to find you, or do you reach out to them on this program?
Well, a little bit of both. You know, I think that we put out notice of the program sometimes in the water bills, the tax bills or the water bills. And, you know, it's a known program, but it could use some more word of mouth. We every now and then will market through the mayor's newsletter, but we also have limited dollars, and we do, you know, we do spend the money on a regular basis. We get it out the door, so it's kind of balancing getting the word out there about the program with the fact that there's limited resources to support these types of projects.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Wright. President Albright.
Thank you. I'll add my thanks, Ms. Berman, for the summary presentation. I wanted to ask you about the 22,500,000 for development of housing under the American Rescue Plan piece. Is that just for Newton, or is that split amongst the consortium?
The Home Art program, the 5.4 million.
Yes.
So it's not just for Newton, it's for the Home Consortium, which is 13 member communities. So when the requests for proposals go out, one of the, obviously the top kind of eligibility is the project based in one of the 13 member communities. So it could be that Newton sees a project through the Home Art dollars, or it may not. It just depends on what projects are out there that fit under these eligibility criteria. And then, you know, if there is competition for the funds, then there will be decisions that have to be made.
So have we had that before? Is that a new program, or have we done that before?
No, the American Rescue Plan, I mean, this is the first time that it's come forward, and Home Art was one of the many programs funded through the American Rescue Plan. So this is a first and one-time program.
Okay, so it feels like we should find some organization to apply for that. You know, somebody that wants to do 100% affordable housing, we should get them on the list to apply. Do we have anybody we can encourage? I guess the plan hasn't been approved yet, but once it's approved, then can we do that?
Yes, I mean, the request for proposals will be marketed across the entire 13 communities, and obviously we'll make aware those developers who develop affordable housing and provide supportive services in Newton. But it has to be, it's a very specific very specific requirements that come along with the program. So when the requests for proposals are developed, we will get the word out there. But again, it is across 13 communities. So it is likely going to be a competitive process.
And who makes the decision about who gets funded?
It's a consortium across the 13 communities. We have the consortium council, and so the council will likely make the final decision, but we haven't put together kind of the full operational plan for that development and review process of the RFPs yet. We just submitted the plan. Oh.
When you have the, you know, your criteria for funding, I'd love to see it. Just as, because we from time to time hear about people who are interested in doing affordable housing, so it'd be nice to see what the criteria are.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that once the requests for proposals are developed, there'll be, you know, a lot of outreach across Newton as well as the other 12 communities that kind of announce what the program is and what the types of funding streams are and what those criteria will be for each of the different buckets of focus for the program.
Thank you.
All set?
Yep.
Okay, so I see nobody else wishing to speak. I want to welcome Councilor Baker to the table, a member of the committee, and I think I failed because Councilor Ryan is sitting in the back. I failed to introduce her earlier. She's been here since the beginning, member of the committee, ward councilor for Ward 8. So I need a motion to vote to authorize the submission of this document.
I will,
So moved. Okay, go ahead.
move to authorize. Good.
So we have a motion to authorize from Councilor Danberg first, having begun to speak first. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions? Okay, it passes unanimously. Thank you so much, Ms. Berman.
Thank
There's
you.
Going on in the city, and thank you for the extensive report. I think we adopted the consolidated plan or authorized the consolidated plan, maybe, was it 2 or 3 years ago now?
3 years ago. So it's FY 21 to 25. So this is the second to last plan in the 5-year plan. So in about a year from now, we will start to develop the next 5-year consolidated plan.
Well, I think I just want to say that despite the pandemic and the extraordinary years we've all been through, you all have been hard at work. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
So here we go on our next item. 3822, as always, discussion and review relative to the draft zoning ordinance regarding village centers. And I still don't see any other, I see one other member, I think Amy Dane is with us, but I don't see the chair of the Planning and Development Board. If you're there, please announce yourself. But today, as you saw in the memorandum, we're going to focus on or continue our discussion on affordability opportunities, I'll put it that way, and see where the committee stands on that, inviting other councilors and planning board members to weigh in. And then talk some more about design standards, which I want to say it's helpful actually to put that information in one place. I almost can see that as a matrix. Could become a matrix so that we could share it with the public, because you can't say too many times to people that by right development does not mean that you can do anything you want. That there are rules and they reside sometimes in different places, not always in the VCND. But we'll go through those metrics. And then I think if anyone has any outstanding questions that you think are important, or you just want to ask them, but you think are important to the development of version 2, any particular metric that you're concerned about, or whatever, I think we should put that stuff on the table, because this is not our last opportunity for involvement, but a last opportunity before we get the version 2 in a couple of weeks to begin deliberating the next version. So with that, Ms. Kyra, I'm sure you have a presentation for us, or that you're going to lead us through the memo in some way. If you have a presentation, I'd love for you to go through the whole thing first before we opine on it. But you tell me how you would like to proceed.
I'm happy to just recap the affordability piece. So
Okay,
that maybe you have a really
Do that
good
first.
guided conversation on it, and then switch to the design standards and
okay,
have that conversation.
okay,
And I do have one slide. That's it, just so to remind everybody. But a couple weeks ago, we had presented this proposal where, as part of the village center zoning, there would be a bonus, a density bonus, a height bonus, and a building footprint bonus. So long as those projects provide additional affordable housing. So it's a good segue from previous conversation. As we all know, there are 3 sub-districts within the village center zone right now, village center 1, 2, and 3. This would only apply to the village center 2 and 3 zones. So we really are talking about a very small percentage of the city, but really offering an opportunity to get some additional affordable units here. And we presented 2 options for discussion. Option 1 would be an additional floor. Option 2 would be an additional 2 floors. In both options, the building footprint would be able to expand an additional 2,500 square feet. And through that allowance, a developer would have to provide in option 1, at least 25% of the units be affordable, and option 2, at least 30% of the units be affordable at an average of 65% AMI. And I think I just want to ground it, since we were just talking about how the city and the consortium is using outside funds to promote affordable housing or affordable rental programs and things like that. This is a floor with no subsidy. These would be percentages that through our economic analysis that we showed could be provided with no subsidy. So there's an opportunity for greater if a nonprofit developer or someone comes in through this project. But again, this is a floor. And these are the options on the table, and hoping to get some clarity and guidance for you, because as we said, because we are writing, actively updating to the version 2.0, and we want to make sure that this makes it in and gets the feedback incorporated into it that it deserves.
thank you very much. President Albright, and then Councilor Baker and Mike.
This wasn't my question, but you raised an interesting issue. What if somebody comes in to do 100% affordable housing? Do they get the bonus?
Yeah,
Definitely.
Okay, okay,
This is the floor.
yeah, you have more than,
minimum.
yeah,
Okay,
that's
got it.
minimum.
Okay. So,
The floors.
Yes.
now I can't remember what my original question was, but I'll comment on the, oh, I know what it was. I know I remember, we studied the land-based, land-wise, data. But have you run this by, or have you heard from any of the people who have recently done housing in Austin Street guy or the Frio guy to say, you know, what do you think about this? Would you
Sure.
take advantage of the bonus if you had the chance?
we haven't specifically reached out. We can do that. But I will say that the assumptions that got us to these numbers, those are the exact projects that were input into the model, and those, you know, those construction costs, those various pieces to get to this working number. But that's a good point. We should reach out to those.
Yeah, and just to hear what they
Yeah.
have to say.
And,
That's a good idea.
you know, it's meant to be a bonus. We're not anticipating everyone will take advantage of it. It's not like the actual base inclusionary zoning requirements where we need to make sure that's fairly carefully calibrated. I mean, this is as well, but it's still an option. You don't have to do this. So if this doesn't pencil out for someone, that's fine.
Okay. So the thing,
Go ahead.
the thing I wanted to say about the option two is, I still think that there are places in the city where option two could work. That's not, it's not for every place in the city.
Right.
And so if we could, or if you could, or somebody could figure out, indicate on the map where we thought the option two projects could live. I would hate to do away with it because we say, you know, across the board, no 7-story, 6.5-story buildings, because maybe there's a few places in a few villages that it could work.
Mhm.
So it's just my opinion on it.
So you pretty much did this, President Albright, but eventually I think I'd like everybody to weigh in on this piece to help give you a sense of where the whole committee is. If you could say whether you prefer option one or option two or nothing, or under what circumstances, that would be good. So heard you on option two. Are you saying that option one is something you'd like to see written into version two?
Absolutely, I would absolutely love to see option one, and I'd actually, if you could find a way to indicate some areas in 2 or 3 of the largest villages where option two could live, then I'd be fine with that as well.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Baker, you're next.
Thank you. So I'm trying to remember what I said before, so I want to make sure I'm at least consistent with my prior statement.
I'll look it up.
But it's always a risk. Let me take it from the smallest first. I am very uneasy about any option next to VC1 in certain situations. I think that puts a height situation right where you not necessarily want it to occur. VC2. In other words, this says option 1 or 2 can occur in either village 3 or village 2.
Yes,
Yeah.
not in VC one,
I understand, but I'm concerned about the VC2
adjacent to VC
adjacent
one.
to VC1.
I see.
Okay, so that's a sensitive area, and I would not necessarily support either option in that context. I'd be more receptive to VC3 option 1. I guess my concern is that the more height you put in that is as of right in this context, and I understand the rationale for it, you really don't have the ability to look at the situation on the ground in the same way that you have a special permit. I know that the thrust of the conversation has been to take special permits out of this situation, but it does seem to me that if you're going to have height elements of any significance, you really got to make sure it fits into the site better than you would necessarily just by the as of right option. So my preference is option 1 and option 1 only in VC3, unless there's a very powerful case to be made that there's a situation that based in the VC1.
Okay, thank you. Councilor Wright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one thing in these charts, which I would find helpful, and I think other people would, like you say, a plus 2,500 square feet footprint. But many people might forget, what does that compare to? So, you know, the plus 2,500 square feet is 25% increase footprint for up. And then for VC2, and for VC3, it's 17%. So I think that will be helpful on these charts. And also, you know, we're talking about heights. It would be good to actually put the heights on there. So on VC2, on the base condition is, I think, 54 feet and 65 feet. And then going to option 3, it's like 78 to 86, which is on BC two, like Counselor Baker said, especially if it's a budding BC one, that seems quite excessive. And then you go to, BC three, where you're at 66 and 74, depending if it's flat roof, pitch roof, going up to 90 and 98 or 101 feet, depending if there's that, we talked about today, the 13 feet versus 12
And
feet. in
that's,
that.
you're just referring to option 2, right? The additional 2 stories.
Yes.
Okay,
So it would be helpful on there too, to realize this. There's places where BC three abuts, BC one, and there's also in BC three where there are 2-family homes that are are part of BC three and stuff. So I think any of these have to be very careful. I mentioned before, I'd like to see instead maybe a BC four. And that's where you can pick it out, what areas, that you can go maybe higher, maybe like the Walgreens in Newton Center could be higher. Because that's not abutting any residentials on the north side of the street. The shadows are gonna, won't really affect anything, maybe a little bit on the fire department, but it wouldn't be much of a concern. Heights overall, I think, and what people have told me we're starting so high to begin with. It would be great if we bring everything down 1 or 2 stories, especially in the village centers in Newtonville and West Newton, people would like to see 3 or 4 stories. And maybe a little bit on Washington Street, a little bit higher, but we're going now, we're talking about 6 and 7 stories, with these additional options. So if we brought everything down a floor or 2, and then adding these options, that would be good. Now, what I've been reading with Brookline, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that they're doing a maximum 4 stories. And they're giving the incentive for commercial on the first floor is to decrease the amount of affordable units. And that's what they're proposing. So they're just doing a maximum 4 stories. And then if you look at Lexington, and they're having a vote this week, except for Hartwell Ave, which is kind of like our Wells Ave, I think the maximum is 4 stories, 4, it might be 5, but I think it's maximum 4 stories. And then the Hartwell Ave can go a lot higher, a little bit higher than ours, just 1 more story than the option 2. So I think, what we're looking at and the actual, feet, it's turning our villages into cities. And I'd like to see 3 to 4 stories, and then in other specific areas, you could go a little bit higher. Now, my one question, which I think I know the answer, but a few other people have asked me, and I just want to clarify it. So in our latest maps where we darkened the streets where we want commercial on the first floor. And so where we could do option 1 or option 2, none of that housing will be counted towards the MBTA communities numbers, correct? Or we're requiring it.
that's correct.
So now in the streets where we're not requiring the commercial and we do have option 1 and option 2, the additional floors would not count towards the MBTA Community Act numbers, correct?
Yeah, so we would count,
Option 2 wouldn't.
well, option
one.
1 wouldn't either, because the
Is-
maximum is 20%.
Yeah.
You can only go to 25% if you have a 40R.
So the extra floors and stuff would not count. What would be interesting to do, and which I requested last time is, and once you bring out the new maps, and you're counting the units for what's counting towards the MBT community number of 8,330, there is a lot that won't be counted, but run the calculations anyway. So right now, we're looking at increasing our housing by 25%. I see that with these other ones, it's probably will increase it 40 or 50%, because a lot of it is not counted towards the MBTA Communities Act numbers. So I'd like to see those numbers be run just to see what it is, what's the overall effect to the city.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of information there. I think putting in the overall feet that is allowed in addition to the stories, we can of course do that. I think one thing I want to say to that, you in this committee have stated you want to see a variety of building heights. The reason why we're getting a max of all of our new buildings at a certain height and they're all the same is because our height max is low enough that everybody is reaching that. The numbers that you put forward are a maximum. And to President Albright's point, have we spoken to developers? We have spoken to developers about this point. Those maximums are atypical for every development. They don't want to build 12-foot floor-to-floor residential heights. So I think by creating a zoning framework that allows for the heights that you mentioned means we may get one or two of those types of buildings, but we will see a variety of heights. An 18-foot floor-to-floor in one building, a 15-foot floor-to-floor height on the ground floor in another, 10'6" on the upper stories and 12 feet in another. So I think you will get that variety in these scenarios. So I just want to be clear, when we put those heights, they're a maximum allowance, but we would expect to see a range of heights. I think when it comes to
So I compare things and we'll just do the heights. So, we're looking at, and I have to say, I was corrected and I went through my numbers last time. I was thinking the option 2 went to what, 110 feet, but it goes up to, I think, 90, 101 or so. But, if we're comparing that to, people to give a visual, like Trio is 60 feet. So we're talking, 50% taller than that, which is 90 feet, type of thing. So some people can't see and visualize what that actually is, but if they have something to compare it to, I think that is helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, and more likely we'd see Trio with one additional story of the same, scale that the stories are at Trio. So those numbers, like Zach said, are absolute maximums meant to allow a bit of flexibility, but we're unlikely to see every floor maxed out. It's just to not get into being overly prescriptive about those floor-to-floor heights. But still setting the max number of stories. So it's not that you could sneak in some extra stories because you have that additional feet in height.
Mhm. And did you want some more? Cut you off. Something else.
I would say, I think you mentioned Brookline. I mean, they're looking to comply by reducing the amount. They're looking to guarantee ground floor retail by reducing the amount of overall affordable units that are on site. In these scenarios, we can get both through our economic analysis. We can get ground floor retail that is required, and we could get 25% affordable units if that is where the committee is going.
Zach, would you speak one more time about your initial statement, though, that I'm hearing in neighborhood area councils also, not all across the board, but in two of them, that folks want to reduce the story height in certain villages. But the economic analysis we did is why we have that as the starting point. So we'd have to give something else up, as you're suggesting Brookline has,
Right.
in order to reduce the baseline, if you will.
Correct.
So, but people are building 3 and 4 story buildings in our village centers. So it can be done. We have approved, and I know right now it's not a great time, everything's kind of skyrocket, but a lot of different projects came in 3 or 4 stories for in the village center. So they did the numbers and it was profitable for them at that time to do it. So
Yeah, I'm not aware of many 3-story. We do see some 4-story, and what we're proposing is 3.5 and 4.5. So I think we're not far off. And you don't know what the history of that land was, how long they've owned it, because a lot of it is the upfront land costs. So there are situations where someone has owned that land for a long time. We also haven't seen some of these built. So some of them have been approved, but we've yet to actually see them actually get through the process and be built.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a rare circumstance with COVID and building, you know, supplies and that quadruple and everything and, you know, I talk to Mark Development and all the time and their projects and why it's stalled and it's, and, you know, the cost of money right now, but 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that was not the case.
It's not a new phenomenon, though. I served on land use for 10 years. I remember specifically, a really lovely project that was 3 stories and proposed in the Noniantum area. I think it was Adams.
Is that Southeast Barber Shop?
It could be, it was some number of years ago. And it was
For a
lovely.
while.
We got everything we asked for and the developer seemed really happy to do it and they couldn't build it way before COVID. So I think setting clear expectations makes a huge difference in the real world. In terms of getting people to come in and actually do a project.
And get the housing and get the affordable
Yeah.
housing that comes along with it. I mean, there also is a need for housing across the city, not just to comply with MBTA communities, but
Right.
because there's a great need for housing of all types and sizes and price points. And if, you know, we have a bit extra and we get some more housing and we get the affordable housing that comes along with it, and can get the ground floor retail and all the things that we want. Yeah, I think that's a good thing.
It's a balancing act. We can't, yeah, but we all know that, but it's a complex puzzle and we're trying to balance objectives. We're not gonna make everybody happy. Maybe not even around this table. Thank you. All set for now? Yeah, okay. Counselor Danberg is next. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna call on you if you don't.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank Councilor Wright for submitting the memo that she did with the list of items that she was concerned with, because while some of us in the council are fairly new and not as familiar with where these items might reside in different areas, whether it's zoning or engineering
We're
or.
on the next item.
We're not there yet.
We're not there.
Oh, all right. Okay.
We're still on
Okay, so we're talking
affordability.
Affordability.
Yeah.
Okay.
And do you want, are you
Yes,
interested in
on
option one or
option one.
two?
I'll leave it to that. I would absolutely affirm option one without a doubt, without any doubt at all. And I think that option two, Councilor President Albright's suggestion that there would be several villages and several areas in the city where option two would comfortably fit. I completely agree with that. I also think that the suggestion that there not be an option two next to a VC one might be a very reasonable suggestion. That an option two only reside next to not next to a VC one, but only next to a VC two and a VC three. I think that both option one and option two are only suggesting a half story and 1.5 stories more than a lot of places have now. In Newton Center, we have close to an option two. So I think that certainly Newton Center is one of the areas where we could look at an option two. There are reasons why developers and landowners have not gone ahead and built even what can be built now, because in order to go up at all, you have to do it under special permit. And the permitting process has been so costly that and the risk of spending a lot of money and being turned down is just not one that current landowners are willing to take. So yes, option one, right away, I think that is as viable pretty much anywhere. I think I think option two for a few places that are to be discussed, and I think keeping option two away from VC one.
Okay.
Thank you. Can I put something on the table that relates to this, because it's come up twice now,
Sure.
and maybe people could comment on that. So, you know, if you have a far enough setback, putting a VC two next to a VC one can work. If the setback is work, or if it's a tiered construction and setback, if the building itself is setback. So I'd like people to think about those two things, because I've seen taller buildings work next to smaller buildings if there's a setback and if it's tiered.
But it's very, let me just make one comment, and then I'll cede the floor. That's true in that we have to be very careful about saying we'll never do X, Y, or Z. Because the exception will always prove the rule. And there are locations where lots of these things would work, only in maybe 1, 2, or 3 spots in the city, but where they would work. So, yeah, good. Thanks for bringing that up.
That is a point that I'd like planning to speak to. There are some requirements already built into this draft requiring setbacks to residential areas if it's a VC2 or VC3 or one or the other of them. I can't remember.
Sure.
But it might be something we need to revisit specifically with
Right.
respect to this proposal. And can you talk about that? Can we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that would
Councilor
be.
Baker might.
I mean, that would be a standard that we could attach. So yeah, and you're correct that in VC two and in VC three, abutting a residential district within 50 feet, or sorry, in VC three, I think it's just in VC three, within 50 feet of a residential lot, you drop a floor. So 4.5 stories is the height in VC three. Within 50 feet of a residential district, 3.5 stories is the cap. So you have a tiered system. We could do the same for this and leave it at that. We could say there's a whole host of ways we could do it.
And we might want to diagram that with respect to the different expected heights, you
Sure.
know, and see if that's enough. Especially if we're going to give an option, either an option 1 to a VC3. You know, so location matters, the configuration of the site and the size of the site matter.
Sure.
Okay, on this point, Council Wright, and then I'm gonna go to Council.
Yeah, so in Newton Corner, and we talked about this before, there are some residential houses that are in a non-residential district. So they don't get those setbacks and things like that. And in Newton Corner, everything's right on top of them. So they literally, 15 feet can have a 7-story building, and that's on the south side of them. So they'll always be in darkness. And there's like 10 properties or so that are like that. Because they're being used as residential, but they're not in the residential zone. They're in the business zone.
Some of them are being used as businesses.
I know there are some that are used as
Yeah, they look like
businesses.
they're residential,
Yeah.
but they are actually a
Yeah.
commercial business.
Yeah.
Um,
I went through and looked at each one and the use of each one, but there are some that are residential, but they don't, and I don't know what we can do about that because they don't get the setbacks, they don't get the step downs.
They're
Even though
non-conforming use. That's what
Yeah,
our
it's-
previous
it's kind of-
zoning ordinance.
Yeah,
did.
kind of same as our existing zoning when it, references the, different requirements next to a residential district.
Yeah,
That
but
doesn't.
those houses were there before the zoning, being used as a residential.
Yeah, I mean, they were there before our existing
Yeah.
zoning typically, and our existing zoning doesn't treat them differently because they're not in a residential district. They're not, so there are going to be some of those.
But if they don't have, you know, an 80 or 100 foot building, you know, 15 feet from their property line.
So
Some of them do.
we can, we probably shouldn't get into the part where we recognize that, you know, before 1920, we didn't have any zoning and all kinds of adjacencies occurred that were perhaps undesirable. So, but we love some of the buildings that were built back then and want to preserve them. So, but we're gonna have to draw some lines, I think. Councilor Leary?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, Newton Corner, I do want to be sensitive to those structures. I guess that's a case where for us to need to get going on the residential component of our zoning. I do want to be cognizant of, a very large building going next to a two-story home. I think we all feel that way. But these are the things that I'm very consistent with what I'm looking at when I see something like this. Yeah, it has to be consistent with our economic analysis, right? It has to be doable and buildable. I'm totally comfortable with 3.5 and 4.5 stories in BC2 and BC3. One of my priorities is I'd like to actually see affordable housing get built. So anything we can do to do that, while at the same time, I look at good design and setbacks and other things that we use to moderate a building footprint or bulk to make it fit in to, other area, into say a BC1 area. I'm also, the cognizant of our goals for climate action and the efficiency and sustainability that goes along with some increased density. I don't see it, density is a bad thing at all. But again, good design is very important with that. Cities are much more efficient than other, suburban areas. So we have to think about the future that's coming at us with climate change and the really the housing crisis that we're having right now. So I am in support of what you have here. I'd like to see more examples of how they would fit in, and again, should go back to the tools we're using for good design, for setbacks, and also these other little goodies that are really important. Like stormwater improvements and more bike lanes, protected bike lanes, and safe crossings for pedestrians and accessibility. These are all.
Let's get into those when we get into design standards.
Okay, I
Okay.
will. I'm just kind of putting it together because I'm looking at the whole picture here. And those are all really important to me. And I also think that it would be a good idea to identify locations in BC3 that would be appropriate for 6 or 7 story buildings. I wouldn't want them everywhere in our village centers, but I think there are locations that they would be appropriate.
So are you saying option 1? Yeah, option 2 by location?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
I'm seeing a pattern. Okay, Councillor Princeton or Ryan? Who wants to go first? Councillor Princeton, okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for calling on me when I didn't raise my hand. So, first of all, when I first looked at this, I thought it was sort of a menu, like anyone could choose, option 1, or I can choose option 2. It wasn't like we are going to choose one of these to add to the zoning, and I even liked it then. So I'm supportive of the concept. I think this is exactly the concept that we sort of all talked about. You have reduced to, words and put it into a graph. I will be surprised if anyone expresses opposition to this as a concept. I was struck by the green communities numbers that we saw last time and the lack of progress we made towards that goal with the proposals as they were. So that's kind of coloring everything I'm thinking about, both because I think we need to comply with the Green Communities Act, but also because it's good policy and it's smart and we need to do it for all the reasons you expressed earlier, Ms. Tyra. So what I keep thinking about is the fact that, well, maybe we didn't get close enough because there weren't enough housing only options. And I don't know to what extent that limited the number of units that the analysis spit out. And so I keep thinking that we need either to change the law, which I don't think we can count on, or housing only options throughout the village centers, which are somehow less attractive. And by attractive, I think I mean financially to a developer than the mixed use options would be. Because I think we want mixed use options to be built and to be taken advantage of. But I think we need housing only options to comply with the law. If that makes sense. I don't know if I'm thinking about this the right way, but and so I don't know how that calculation works out. I don't know if it gets incorporated into something like this. Again, I think was 20% the max in the DHCD guidelines?
20% is the max,
Okay.
assuming that we can show that it's feasible. So we don't know what that looks like yet.
But I
what
think
they're
their
gonna
language
want.
was like, under no circumstances will we approve anything over
Exactly.
this
unless
level, and that was
it's a 40
20%. Okay. So I don't know if one of the options should be targeted towards that 20% cap to sort of hit, you know, as much as we can of the DHCD guidelines. I mean, I know Green Communities doesn't have to weigh on everything we do, but it feels like it factors into everything that we're doing throughout this process. So,
MBTA communities, right?
yes, I'm sorry.
You're saying green communities over, and I'm thinking you must have had a report.
Look, when I say MBTA, I mean Green Communities. Option 3, she means option 2. This is how this is. Okay, so, yes, that's on you guys, not me. So that.
Better green communities goals either. Just by the way.
Oh, I'm sorry. So that's how I'm thinking about it. Again, I like the concept, but I really feel like we need to especially think about housing only options that potentially take advantage of a bonus, you know, structure to try and meet those goals. I think in an analysis like this option, in my mind, again, option 2 would not be intended to comply with that because it would hit a much higher level of affordability. But there could be an option that maxes out at the DHCD max and tries to maximize the amount of units that could be built. Again, potentially factoring in the fact that you still have a mixed use option that's even more financially viable.
So you support this proposal as though it were a menu.
Yes.
So both options you feel should be on the table.
Again, I think the concept is exactly right. I feel like we're all thinking about this at the VC2 and VC3 heights that we've seen. I'm just not sure that those are going to be the final heights because I think we need to try harder to comply with the MBTA Communities Act. Heights are going to factor into that. And as a concept, I like this. It's going to be different though if those VC2 and VC3 heights change for people.
Yeah. I understand.
Probably not for me, but you know.
On this point, because, okay, go ahead.
I think this is an interesting point. Is there an option of 0.5? Because you're talking about a 20%, is that what I'm hearing?
That's what I think Councilor Princeman's suggesting is that you
I'm-
have an option that maxes out.
Yeah, I'm sort of intrigued by that because it gives you an ability to hit 2 different goals at the same time. So I think it would be worth going back to look at that. And the other thing I guess that if you have the as of right, I would, I'm more amenable to the additional height and the additional opportunity if it is a special permit because of the light site specific. But if he's asking for an option 0.5, I'm interested in that.
Okay, thank you. On point, I want to go to Councilor Ryan. Yeah, same point.
Yes, same
Okay.
point. The thing is, I wouldn't do the 0.5 if we're requiring commercial on the first floor, because it's not gonna come anyways.
No,
So we'll get the extra affordability.
no, that's just for a housing.
Yeah, housing only for the 0.5. Option 0.5.
Okay, just trying to make your job easier. Councilor Ryan.
I was sitting here listening to Council President on green, did I miss anything?
Sorry, I'm very sorry.
He meant the climate action plan, you know, I don't know.
And then I was thinking of the trolleys on the green line, so maybe that was.
I thought I was on a roll. I wasn't.
Anyway, I'm, in VC3, I'm for both option 1 and 2, question. I would be, you know, in VC2, I would discuss, tailoring the lots right next to, VC1. I think that would be the best option to go if we looked at that and, you know, I'm not gonna call it an exception, but that we just come out with it as written that way, that if it's, next to the VC1 neighborhoods, then we should bring it down. And not let the height, I want as much affordable housing as we can get. I do want mixed use in village centers. We just have to keep doing that. And the best way we can find to hit the mark on the MBTA communities. But like I said, VC3, there shouldn't be any question. I mean, we're not putting skyscrapers. Let's get it, if we can get it more affordable than another floor, that's fine. And that 0.5 option intrigues me also. Discussed.
Okay. Thank you. And I have a few hands up online, so I'm just gonna go down the list. Counselor Bowman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So, let's say a couple of things. One, I'll just maybe start with that the Affordable Housing Trust today took a vote on their preference for advocating on this option 1 versus option 2. And there will be a letter coming, but they, of course, absolutely support option 1 and are really hoping that the council will support option 2 as well. And I think, you know, the reason is pretty clear. I went back just to refresh my memory from the 324 meeting where this was first discussed, and the modeling of the Walgreens site, I think, is a perfect example of what happens when you add additional housing, so additional floors. So in that, 24 units were in the base condition. And if it was 17% affordability, there would be 5 affordable units built in that. The addition of an additional floor in that, the model showed that 52 units would be built. So almost 28 more housing units. And at 25% affordability, it would jump up to 13 units. So another 8 families that we could house. And if it went to option 2, it went up to 63 units. So it's almost 40 more units of housing. And at 30% affordability, it's 19 units. So 14 more units than in the base. So, you know, this isn't adding a floor and you get 5 or 8 or 10 more units. It's a very significant impact. And we don't have a lot of sites like that Walgreens site throughout the city. We have some. So, you know, I'm really hoping, obviously, it sounds like we're coalescing around strong support for option 1. And, you know, I would strongly support option 2 as well. But if in the mode of compromise, we talk about spending the effort to identify places where we think option 2 is more viable, then I would hope that we could support that, and looking at that very broadly, because the impact is, and it just not only helps us meet our affordability goal, but it actually helps us meet our housing goal and our support for housing in village centers to support our businesses. You know, 63 good sized units right in the heart of a village center is, to me, a much more appealing project than 24 units. And I think that there are ways through design and consideration of location and setbacks that it will be lovely. So I'm strongly urging my colleagues to fully support option 2, but, you know, at least support identifying locations where we could identify VC3 locations that we would be fine with 2 additional units for affordability. The other thing that I will say is just having had conversations with affordable housing developers, and one of the reasons why it might be a very hard sell for 100% affordability in a village center if we want to maintain ground floor retail, is that I understand that when they're doing their financials to get the lending in place, that they zero out the amount of money that the rental income that they would get from commercial retail. So they have to make the project work. They build the commercial on the first floor, but the numbers have to pencil out as if that space is completely unrented for the eternity of the project. So that, if you're requiring a lot of affordability, and that's where the problem sort of comes in financially. So I think we're unlikely to get 100% affordable with commercial on the first floor. I think we're much more likely. So that's another reason why I think option 2 is so important, because at least we would be getting a higher level of affordability. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Bowman. Councilor Lorego.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start off with a question for Mr. Lamel. And forgive me, sometimes the audio is a little bit difficult when you're in the committee room. So if I didn't hear you correctly, please correct me. I heard you say that you'd spoken to some developers who had said that they wouldn't necessarily build to the maximum height. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Can you tell me which developers you spoke with?
We spoke with the developers of Trioso Mark Development and the developers of 28 Austin Street.
That's it.
For this specific question, yes.
Okay, so I just as going forward, I think it would be very helpful when your sampling is limited to 2, that you advise us of that. I just think that's part of the mix. I have to point out too, that I heard a little while ago, how difficult the special permit process is for developers. And we have 2 holes in the ground right now in the city, one in Dunstan East and one, or Dunstan West, forgive me, and one at Riverside. And the Dunstan project, of course, the 40B, where there was no special permit approval process at all. So I just want to note that. I want to just ask a question about the building footprint bonus. When you add the 2,500 square feet of bonus, how does that interplay with the setback requirements that are going to be proposed for these projects and the other requirements that we have for them?
So you would still have to comply with setbacks and the various other requirements to get that bonus. And that's why in the examples we use in the case studies for the meeting that was on March 27th, you might have seen that they didn't get to the maximum footprint because they reduced it for the setbacks, for the parking. They tried to make kind of those real world conditions. So yes, you'd have to meet all the various requirements that are in the zone.
Would you at some point be able to provide us with examples of either existing plots of land or plots of land that could be combined where you could achieve that 2,500 square foot addition and what that would look like? Because I'm having a hard time visualizing it, quite frankly, if you're not able to build with the setbacks. And I ask that because if we think we're going to be doing something here to increase affordability, then we better understand what's realistic and what's not realistic. And there's the height piece is rather easy. You can decide whether or not you want to go from 4 stories to 5 stories or 5 stories to 6 stories. But the footprint piece, I'm just having some difficulty understanding, and maybe that's my ignorance. I just want to add one other thing along the lines that Councilor Krinsman said about our difficulties with all of this work in getting close to complying with the MBTA Communities Act. And I heard from someone that you talked about encouraging mixed use on the first floor, but I want to be very clear, we cannot require that. And I'm not aware of any tools we have that could even encourage it without running afoul of the act. And if I'm missing something, please fill me in.
Yeah, so we can encourage it. However, that was our first proposal, is you only could do 2.5 stories in VC3 if it was all residential and 4.5 if it was mixed use. And that's compliant with MBTA communities. However, we only get to count the purely residential option. Based on the conversations we've since had and what we discussed in committee, a couple meetings ago, was instead identifying mixed use priority streets. And the feedback, I think, generally was just to require it on those streets. So we're now looking at what that means for our numbers if we just take those areas out of what we submit to MBTA communities so that we can require mixed use.
Thank you, Ms. Carr. I appreciate this is a very difficult task. I, for one, am very concerned about the idea that we're going to let a developer take up potentially take up fairly large portions of village centers and put all housing in, because that, it seems to me, really defeats everything in it. And if you don't think a developer can buy up a fairly large portion of land, look at the developer Trio. They bought up virtually a city block. So it can and does happen. And I think it would be frankly naive of us not to act on the assumption that developers can and will do it. And I think it's a tricky puzzle and I don't have an easy answer, but I think since it's so important that we try to maintain the vitality of our village centers, I'd be very concerned with letting too much by right, housing on the first floor. It's not a knock on housing. It's just that does nothing to add to the vitality of the village center. And indeed, if you have too much of it, defeats it. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Sure, you heard Ms. Kyra's point. Where we landed a couple of meetings ago is that we're going to assume that we may not require retail commercial use on the ground floor. We're going to assume that for now.
I think
And
we're going to assume that we are requiring it, right?
we're going to assume that
For MBTA communities,
for MBTA communities, we're going to assume that we're not allowed to count it.
Yes.
And so we have a map that was put out several weeks ago that shows, underlines priority streets where we will require ground floor retail because of exactly what your concern is our concern. We don't want developers to come in and make all residential projects in the heart of our village centers.
I recall that map, Madam Chair. I think it was a good start. I think that's something that's going to require a significant amount of refinement in order to make that work properly. But we'll see that when we see the next iteration. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Downs, you're next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to say a lot of the things, but Councillor Leary beat me to the point. I think village centers are exactly where we want to have housing, particularly affordable housing, because it'll meet a lot of our climate goals. It'll meet a lot of our transportation goals, frankly. These are, when you have a lot of housing in the village center and it's small and it's affordable, people can do a lot of their errands without a car, without needing a car at all. And that's something we want more of rather than less of. I also took Mr. Lamel's comment about the variation in heights that at this point we're landing on. leading to a kind of uniformity, where everything's the same height in our village centers if we build it out by right to the max or even not to the max. So I think it would behoove us to go with option 1 and option 2 to the extent we can, just so we don't end up with a monolithic village center height, even with the the step back stories or the gabled roofs or whatever we end up allowing also as a by right option. I think we ought to think about that. I'm not as concerned about height, particularly in village centers. That's often what makes for a comfortable village center is a place where you feel enclosed and where there's a sense of there being a lot of people nearby. Just it makes for a safer and more comfortable street feeling. So those are my thoughts. Just looking at this, I hope you don't rule out option 2. I really think that, and I took Councilor Bowman's comments also. It could be a very useful tool and could get us more affordability at a time when we have a housing crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Downs. Councilor Ryan?
Yeah, I'm just gonna throw something out there quickly. Even though we're offering the height bonuses, how many developers are actually gonna take want to do that? I mean, I think we're talking like, it just seems the conversation's like, oh, they're all gonna be the bonuses. No, they're not. I think it'll be the other way around, that they won't choose to take the height bonus, and it'll just be business as usual. I mean, it'll be, by right, but, I'm just wanting to throw that out.
Yeah, we
Thank
don't
you.
know. I think if we do something like this, we'd want to have some sort of, analysis to see how well it worked, like we do with our IZ ordinance. We have a 5-year sort of look back on it. So I think if we do this, it would be good to track and see who uses it. And the other factor is also building codes. So, at a certain height, you trigger different building codes. So there are, even with, even if you give the bonus, not everyone will always max out that height.
So I guess I'll weigh in too, and then we can move on to our next topic. I'm fully supportive of the option 1. And I think that option 2 works in limited applications. In places where I can see it definitely would not work. So I would love to see an additional set of metrics applied to this proposal to add footprint and height. For conditions such as other folks have raised when it's proximate to VC1 or any residential district, or sensitive site. We also talked about sensitive sites. That was a long time ago, so I just want to raise that again here because I think this, context is, we hope to achieve a development pattern that creates, I'll just say, an enjoyable context, right? And an aesthetically pleasing context. So I think by adding storage mass, I think we have to think through those metrics. Thank you. So we're ready to move on to the next topic, which I believe Ms. Kyra is going to lead. I'm never sure exactly who's on first here, but I think you had a lot to do with this memo, and I'll say again, I mean, Councilor Danforth is going to have to repeat her thanks, but this is a very useful exercise, and some of us have long histories with land use, and so over time you remember, okay, this resides in ISD, this resides in engineering ordinances or whatever. Then we have some new laws now, so I think it was very helpful to put this together, and in most cases you check the box, that an ordinance or a protocol or, the coming, it's been coming for a long time, but we should talk about that too. Standardized construction management plan that we've been hoping for quite some time, years. But very helpful to understand where these different design controls live if they don't live in the VCOD ordinance. So
That's right.
please go ahead.
Sure, and so in general, I think we're in a good place today because so many of our ordinances at the local level and the state level have evolved. I don't know that this would be quite the case, 5 years ago, that we needed the special permit to put a lot of these pieces in. But now things have come along, especially the, stretch code and the specialized code really helps us with the sustainability aspect, in some ways goes further than what we do today with the electrification, 10 communities pilot. That's a huge help. The stormwater ordinance as well. There are things that are written into that now that we used to capture just through special permits. So that's capturing a sort of broader swath and has more stringent requirements that are right in the stormwater ordinance. The other things like the new gov system allows us to build some of these things into the permitting process too, so that they don't get missed. The construction management plan, I agree, we've been talking about for a while. We can still require these things just as part of a construction management plan today. And we can make it clear in your building permit submittals what needs to be part of that and who needs to sign off on that. However, I also think this would be a good opportunity to push that effort along. And I spoke with Commissioner Logic about it. This has been one of his pushes for a while. He's all on board. So I think it's something we'd like to make a priority, working closely with ISD and engineering, the other departments to really get that standardized construction management plan if we are going to allow for more things to be built by right. I think that's an important component.
For the public
Yeah.
listening, can you list some of the things that are in the construction management plan?
Yeah, so the construction management plan could include a number of these items. It could include the construction rules. We already have construction hours set by ordinance, hours where you cannot do any construction demolition outside of that. There's also noise levels that you can't exceed. But that could also be in the CMP along with material delivery, placement on site. The vibration control plan, the rodent and pest control plan.
Dust control.
Dust control. We could also reiterate repairing damage to public property. That's already required anyway. If you damage public property or public ways, part of your engineering permit, you're required to repair that, whether it was by right or by special permit. So a number of these things could be through the CMP. There are some things that are already handled in zoning elsewhere, but could potentially use improvement, such as electric vehicle charging stations, although that gets addressed somewhat through the stretch code and specialized code. Bicycle parking is one that I think should be updated, whether we write our own section just for the village center zoning. We can also like to address the underlying zoning for the whole city for bicycle parking, just to update that. It's a little outdated. But we do have a requirement in there that even if we don't write anything else in, could apply.
Do you think it should be updated because we're not doing it according to the number of units?
Right, we're doing it according, thank you, to the number of vehicular parking spaces, which, the way we're going with trying to have less parking, less reliance on vehicles, we still want the bicycle parking. So even if there aren't a lot of vehicular parking stalls, we want the bicycle parking. So we want to look at how that ratio, short-term and long-term bicycle parking requirements, Also thinking about, space for electric bikes, which might take up a bit more space, if you're a little heavier, might have different bike storage requirements. At what point do you need to provide a locker and showers or a bike repair station? All of these things are good examples from other communities we can look at. And could be an effort in the underlying zoning, or it could be some things we write into the village center.
So
Zoning.
using this as an example, the bike parking as an example, maybe you could speak to, so we could, as you say, we could put that requirement right in the VCOD. It's better to have it in a general ordinance, but let's say we put it in the VCOD because we're not getting there yet with the. But if then we had a general ordinance that applied to everything, it would make the thing in VCOD null and void, right?
Yeah, it depends on how we write the village center zoning, that, but yes, it could. So if we do ultimately update the rest of the zoning, it could. Or we could use the village center as a sort of test case. Certainly would be, we don't have a lot of time as part of this effort to do a big effort on updating bike parking, but, I think that is one that we should take a look at, whether it's part of this separate effort. There were some things in here that I think we definitely want to include. The trash pickup was an important one, and that's one where we've been having conversations lately with Public Works on when the city will pick up trash for residential properties, because the ordinance that governs this right now says that the city is responsible unless a special permit says otherwise. So that hasn't been so consistently applied when the special permit says you are responsible for private trash and recycling pickup. So we've been working on making that more standard. So we're proposing just writing that in to the village center zoning. It just makes things easier there. Same with undergrounding the connection to the site. So we're not talking about along the street, but the connection to the site. We require as part of a standard language in special permits that you underground to the site and within your site. So we can write that into the design standard for the village center zoning. But most things are already covered or can be covered by existing ordinances or policies.
All set?
Yeah.
For now, okay,
Yeah,
so
okay.
President Albright, and then we'll just go down the line here.
I'm concerned about the vibration, and the rat special permit condition. We don't have an ordinance, either one. And so can those conditions find their way into construction management plan?
They can, and so I talked to the Commissioner of Instructional Services as well as the law department about that, and they both said they absolutely can be part of the requirements of the CMP.
Okay, and regardless of the size of the project, like if it's a BC one and they're gonna require it?
Well, we could put, it could be tailored, so it could, there's different requirements, building permit requirements, depending on what you're building, right? So we could say it's this size or this location or more, these are the requirements.
Okay,
Similar to how we're tailoring it through the special permits too, when we apply it, we would take similar logic.
do you think that Mr. Lojak will, Commissioner Lojak will have that template for a construction management plan done in time for us to see it as part of understanding how this all is going to work?
I don't know, it's something we'd like to work with them on, but we can require it even without that standard. The standardized CMP, I think, makes a lot of things easier, but we can just be clear that, you are required to submit a construction management plan, the building permit. And we can just be clear what needs to be part of that, even if we're not creating a nice standard template. We can still list what documents.
Okay, well, that would be useful.
Yeah.
That would be good.
And that we can do easily now through YouGov, because we can show what attachments are required, and we can code it so those show up depending on what you're building. And then we can have, as part of that, we can list out what needs to be included.
So in other words, you can say, you must have a vibration control plan, you must have a rodent control plan, and you must articulate that, and ISD would have the authority to accept or reject.
So, like the landscaping piece, the land use committee does a lot with, screening. You know, requiring screening for maybe a taller building, or I don't know, whatever it is. So how can we deal with the issue of screening in here?
So the screening is often not in village centers. So if you think about the village centers, particularly the areas where we're going to see VC2, VC3, they're built out. You're not screening in between buildings. Most often the buildings are connected, right? There's no space in between them. Where you might want screening, where land use often, is looking at screening is when you're, you have a non-conforming setback and you're extending that, or you're doing additional FAR. It's not, you're buffering a manufacturing use from a residential use. What we're talking about is just in the village centers. The setbacks are gonna provide buffers in particularly VC1 and the limited footprint. In VC2 and VC3, you're looking at mostly built out environment as is. We do have screening requirements when there is surface parking or some screening for service areas, like where the dumpster is located, those sorts of things. And especially when you're adjacent to residential.
So in my ward in Newtonville, we have VC3 abutting residential, single family. And the screening of that project was an important part of it. And it wasn't just screening of the parking lot, it was, a tall fence and trees and all kinds of things. So where we do have, in many of our wards and villages, we have the residential, as we've been hearing about the concerns about VC2 abutting VC1. There are concerns about screening, and I think we should try and do something that's a little stronger.
We do have in the draft that we currently have, we have a couple requirements where a VC zone abuts a residential district. Let's take a look at those and make sure that they're appropriate.
Okay. The traffic. So this was a general question I had, and it comes up in a few of them where the sites, and this one happens to be about traffic studies are part of the site plan review. So what can we do under site plan review to mitigate whatever it might be that's in here that's part of site plan review? How much power does a site plan review have?
So for site plan review, you really just can't deny the project. So you can put reasonable conditions on, but it's not a question of do we allow this or don't we allow this? It's, okay, let's take a closer look at the site. Does this work? Are there ways this could be improved or mitigated? What are some sort of reasonable conditions that could be on there? In general, what we see for those sorts of conditions for transportation, we're trying to bake in to the zoning. So we're trying to limit curb cuts. We're trying to limit where the parking is located, trying to reduce the amount of parking. So you're reducing the number of trips. Or those sorts of things we're trying to build as much as possible into the zoning. So it doesn't need so much review. We do have the option to use review.
So the other one that I had noted about that thing with the use of brick face and full finish and other construction materials, that one is, I don't know how far site plan review can go.
So you are allowed to do design review. And the MBTA communities law has been clear that you can do design review. We don't get, for larger projects, there's some degree of that, but don't often get that in-depth on the material. The goal here is producing housing, and one of the, I think, biggest pieces towards making sure that that is compatible and of quality design is one, making it easier to build, but also controlling the mass of the building. So that's often what people react to is the overall mass of the building, the length of the building, the transparency at the ground floor or kind walls, those sorts of things. So we're trying to build that into the zoning without getting too deep into actual architectural.
Last thing I just wanted to say is, and maybe this is on us, but you know, the mitigation money you mentioned, and that it would end up in a fund to be determined by the council. Do you think the council perhaps should develop some procedures for how that gets decided? I mean, the ward councilors should meet and do something or other, I don't know what, but otherwise, if you don't make a decision about how to spend the money, it floats and it's hard to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think because we haven't seen a lot come in through right projects, I think we do need to develop some sort of policy for how that works. You know, how often that those funds are reviewed, who's coming together to make recommendations on how that money could be used. But right now, it's sort of going through that twice. So first at the special permit, when often some potential projects are identified. But then when the money actually comes in and has to be appropriated, it goes back to the council for approval. And sometimes we don't know when that money is coming or what might be, you know, what project will line up with the timing of it. You know, we have money coming in, you know, for some recent project, it could be many years before we see it. And we may end up funding those projects through other efforts, or, you know, that timing doesn't always work out. So I think there could be actually some added efficiency of having it, the by right projects go into a fund and then have some sort of regular points, some sort of process
Yeah.
for how it gets reviewed.
I
and how
think
it
it's
gets
worth the
done.
council thinking with you about
Yeah,
what
definitely.
process that is and how it all works. It would be outside the zoning, but it would be in place when it starts. And so thank you for going through this and thanks for the list. It's a good list.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention one thing. The law department's advised us a number of times. Materials and methods are not something that we can control with our zoning. It's in the building code. And so every time, anything that's in the building code, we can't require more of, or something different than what's allowed. So, if, you know, a stucco finish is a material that's allowed, you know, we're not allowed to prohibit it as part of our zoning. That's an oversimplification, but it goes for all of these things. But I will also mention the stretch code and specialized code by the really just the stretch code, by the requirements that they impose on buildings, and the testing that is done really requires a higher quality of materiality in the building and in the assembly of the wall or the roof or whatever. Because water intrusion is, you get water intrusion, you get air intrusion. So it's, those new codes are really helping us a lot. Anyway. So I have Danbury, Baker, Wright, Ryan. So, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I started down this road a little while ago, so I'll continue down it. And I thanked and want to thank again Councilor Wright for pulling together the list. I presume that this list came from looking at previous special permits. Is that the case, Councilor Wright, and what
Yeah,
they
so
might have done?
this is not an exhaustive list. This was just, as Councilor Lipoff can attest, that I've been going to a lot of the land use meetings. And so these are typically what I've been seeing.
What's
But-
come up recently?
Yes,
Yep.
but I also wanted, and I, you know, gave it to planning department and not, you guys aren't part of the land use committee, but maybe someone else, that there are more, but this is not all of them, and that's something to think about.
Yeah, and we've been working closely with our current planning team on standard conditions. So I am familiar with the list of standard conditions and help work on that. That's gone to.
And I would just say that I think it's very useful to know and keep in mind what themes that come up over and over again Every site is different, so over the number of special permits and over the years, there will be things that would only appeal, that would only need to be dealt with a particular site. So I would hope, I know that there was a request out for every special, every item that was in every special permit over the past 5 years. I would hope that, that we wouldn't have to go to that length to pull out every, item that was ever, discussed and brought out. But I think that themes of items that, we need to look at are very useful. Especially, it's good for the public to understand what things we deal with on a regular basis. And again, I thank you for bringing those out. You, Masons, again, for those people who either among us or in the public are less familiar with where these things might reside, it's helpful to know that they are someplace. And I don't think that these controls, or most of them, ought to reside in the VCOD, because the I&I, for instance, needs to be dealt with by engineering, and there are many things that need to be dealt with by ISB. But as you say, you picked out 2 or 3 of them that would be appropriate to deal with in the VCOD, and that I'm sure you'll do some more work on that and get that back to us. Use of construction materials I had that down as something that I wanted to talk about. I think Councillor Crossley made that clear that the building code, even the state building code, really regulates that to a large extent. And so it's something that we can't really get into the weeds on. Trash pickup and making 5 or more units the standard, where we would go from city pickup 1 to 4 to 5 or more being commercial pickup. I think that's something that we need to codify if it's not already codified, and the mass of the building was brought up. That's a very important thing. I think that's what I look at and I react to when a building is going to be built. I don't particularly care what goes on inside the building. I'd like the building to house as many smaller units as possible so that we can keep them affordable and we can house more families and more people. On the mitigation funds process, I think that's a very important issue. I seem to remember that Jordan Marsh, which was built way before I ever came on the council, went for many years before all the funds were either expended, or I'm not sure whether there are any funds still left in it, but that I think is a good teaching moment that we need to have a process so that it's regulated. And I think that's all I would say on this. I am glad that the list came out, and I am very pleased to see the 22 items and the explanation of how these things are being taken care of now. And as more items come up, we can add to this list. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Councillor Baker, then right.
So I appreciate the list. I'm going to make a suggestion that there may be some value to pick up on a comment that several of our colleagues have made, to take the list and run it as a time sequence. In other words, what is likely to be required before construction? What is going to be required during construction? What will be required after occupancy? Because I think that it will help us understand it, but also understand the development community understand what we're asking them to do. So it may be that that's just a formatting piece, but there are things as I read the list that really are time delimited or maybe transitional and that sort. So the other a couple of other things that I'd be curious about. And I don't know whether that belongs here or some other provision of the ordinance, but you mentioned space for zip cars or things like that, or bicycle parking. One of the things we've seen and we talked a little bit about is the whole issue of ride sharing and how that works and how pickup and the emergency flasher on our cars has now become the short-term parking system for a good deal of downtown Boston. I don't know if it's true here, but I can tell you this from going to work. And so and people going in to pick up food and then come back out and all of that. So somehow, I'm not sure it's fair to put it on any specific building, but the idea that they're in a major project in some sense is going to have those kinds of impacts. We don't want them in the travel lane. That's the question now. I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear you.
Or the bike lane, people park right in the bike lanes
Yeah.
and then you're forced into the streets. Yeah.
Order of that. But I do think I'm trying to get at the point of, and we're looking ahead. We don't know exactly where all of these things will play out. Scooters were a big idea for a while. They've gotten to be, I understand, a hazard, and a lot of communities are now trying to get rid of them. I guess my point is that some conversation with the transportation people will be very useful here to think about what goes on in these extra standards. There's a excuse me, I think we've tried to do this in the ordinance generally, but again, the cross-referencing to other provisions. So the noise ordinance, the fence ordinance, I mean, there are a number of places that requirements may not apply all the time in the village centers under this model, but there's certainly value in having a look at those and just making sure that we know kind of the universe. And you would do this, I think, if you were coming in for the development review for somebody who says, I've got this parcel under option and I'm really excited about being here. And then you say, well, let us diminish your excitement. We will give you the list of all the things that you have to pay attention to. But I do think it's part of good public service to help people not be caught by surprise in the situation. So to the extent that the sequencing, the cross-referencing, and some of these kind of emerging problems can be articulated here, I think will enhance the ordinance.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we can always do a better job with how we communicate requirements and expectations and process. So I do think this is a good opportunity because we are going to be looking at a slightly different process than we have now for things. So we do need to really think through the all of the details of that and how we communicate that to the public and the development community. So I do think this creates a good opportunity for creating more sort of user-friendly.
And I think if I can just add one, I forgot this. I'm not quite clear, and maybe this is something to consult with the law department, but a number of these things are going to be enforced by ISD in some capacity, right, or engineering. Is it implicit in our building permits or anything that we're doing that they have the right to come on and access the property for inspection purposes? Because zoning can have criminal consequences. I don't want to get into the Fourth Amendment. You need a search warrant to go on the site in order to check out whether somebody's complying. I think you want to be able to have people come through, but you also want to have accountability and say, hey, look, you said you were going to be building 6 stories, but I just went out you're 5 feet from this property line and you're 3 feet because I went out and measured, I mean, I'd like to not have the situation where they have to stand on the street corner and try to inspect from a distance and try and figure out whether someone's complied.
Yeah, and inspections, the inspectors are on the site.
Well, I know they're on the site. I guess the question is it, how is that managed now? And is it?
Part of the building permit, I'm not sure where it comes from, but that's part of the building permit, when you have inspections, the inspector is on site.
Okay, but if there's something that's an ongoing responsibility, do they have the ability to go in and see it after the fact? I just don't know the answer to that. It's just one of these
I'd
questions.
like to make a comment on that when you're finished.
So anyway, I don't know the answer, but I think it's just worth understanding, because if we're asking people to do things without quite as much oversight from the council or other people, we want to make sure the oversight still is there in the administrators.
Could I just make a comment on that? I'm thinking of an example, in Newton Center particularly, of a location that neighbors have repeatedly over the years complained about, that has, let's say, 3 units that houses 15 cars on a regular basis. And the landowner is in all likelihood inviting people who have commercial shops and things to come and rent spaces and cramming all these cars into a parking lot in the back. It's in violation, but I have been told by police when I've tried to follow up on it that they cannot go on the property to inspect and count the number of cars unless invited by the landowner. And that just seems antithetical to try and solving the problem.
Use a drone.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that's, to your point, Counselor Baker, we do need to have the ability, if there is a thought that there might be something going on that shouldn't be going on, to be able to inspect without getting a court order to go in.
And that's, I think, a larger conversation question that's not part of zoning. So whether something is a special permit or by right does not change whether someone's allowed on that property.
There is a zoning ordinance that allows a certain number of well, no, maybe I'm thinking of yard cars that you can't have more than one.
There are zoning requirements that
Again.
apply, and however, I think what you're talking about is the ability for someone, code enforcement, an inspector, the
Mhm.
police, to actually go on site when there's a problem outside of the construction process. That's outside of this. That I recommend talking to Andy, the code enforcement inspector. I know he's very good with finding when there are violations. I think whether they let him on their property or not, he's able to observe and keep records and digs into it. But that's not part of this. And that doesn't change whether it's a special permit or by right, because that's just the initial approval process. What you're talking about is sort of the long-term use and
Long-term.
violation of whether it's zoning or special permit. It's still considered a zoning violation. So whether it's written into a special permit council order or it's written right into the zoning, it's still a zoning violation if they're violating that. It's dealt with by code
I
enforcement.
appreciate that, and I think the question of just the general enforcement is one thing. If there is some implicit consent given for access to ensure that the construction process is done the right way.
And that there is. So for construction, there is. I think your question about long-term use is a different one, but isn't part of zoning and wouldn't be part of this. And this wouldn't change anything, how that happens today.
It's larger conversation.
And that's already on point.
Councilor Baker said something that's triggered something. The light ordinance in particular is often waived by the land use company.
Yeah.
So if we're gonna use our own light ordinance, maybe we better have a look at it.
We are looking at that in carefully.
And it's the parking section. It's
Yes,
not,
exactly.
because there's a light ordinance about light spillovers.
Yeah.
But then there's also the 1 foot candle
It's the
requirement
amount of light that we
That's-
often waive.
that's too high. So that we can change as part of this.
As long as it's on your list, that's good.
You'll be putting that right in the BCOD, because I had the same, okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that. Councilor Baker, are you all set?
Well, I think you've said it, but I just want to reinforce the idea. And several of your colleagues said, you said you didn't want to go back and read all of the special permits, but I think the point is that to the extent that the special permit process has developed a pattern over time of valuable insights that you can read. You certainly want to make sure you don't miss it. I'm operating on the assumption that this list emerged from that process.
Thank you,
Sorry.
thank you. Counselor Wright and then Ryan.
So thank you very much for addressing these. I'm still a little nervous because the way we're going, we're probably gonna approve this zoning possibly in the fall. Definitely before January 1st, because it would be part of the MBTA Communities Act, but probably even before that. And so there's some holes here, unless we nail it down before then. I think some of these is, you know, it would be or could be, you know, in the CMP, or it could be design standards, or it could be, I think what would be helpful is to have 3 columns, you know, or maybe 4 other design standards. These are the things we're going to cover in the design standard. These are the things that are going to be in the CMP. And it sounds like there's an interim CMP until a final one comes, that's more detailed. You know, these will be in the site plan. Now, I'm concerned with site plan, as it's been saying, we cannot deny it. So let's say, you know, you had landscaping as part of the site plan thing, and you want to do it, and the developer's like, no, I can't do it. It's too expensive in that. And so there's there's no teeth. At least from my perspective, there's no teeth with the site plan. So, you know, the items that we list in the site plan, maybe we want to put it into the design standards. Any idea for the final CMP? Is that going to take another, I mean, you've been doing it for years. Is it going to be a year, 2 years?
Well, I don't think it should be that long. We've been talking about for a while, haven't been actively creating a standard CMP that time, but we have been refining through the special permit process what needs to be in the CMP. So I think we have a very good starting point, and we really can just take some of those standard conditions right now, today, and condition them into the building permit requirements without much effort. I think what Commissioner Logic wants to do is get the CMPs in sort of a standard format. So you've got, you know, essentially a binder with different tabs, and, you know, they all sort of look the same and they make it easier for review, which I think would be great. But we can still require these things in the internal. It's just pretty easy to condition them as part of the building permit requirements.
Okay.
So it's really, if I may, just a more work for ISD until we have
Yeah.
that standardized book.
Mhm.
It's the petitioner or the developer or whoever still has to submit a plan for a list of things that go in the CMP. But it's more work for ISD then, because they have to review every one. And because they don't have the standardized form.
Yeah, and I don't think it will take that long to create the standardized form, because so much work has been done through the special permit process to get us to this point. But I think this helps provide sort of that incentive for all of us to focus on it. Get it done.
So I'm going to go through a couple specific questions. On number 8, the transportation plan. You talk about when will there be a TDM policy?
So we have an internal policy that you may have seen through some of the land use petitions that we've been applying. It needs more work, you know, as we apply it to different projects of different scales and different uses. We're finding it doesn't always quite get, doesn't quite work. It's a point system. That could ultimately, when there is something that's, you know, a little more refined, it could become an ordinance. I do think the whole, everything built into the zoning though is doing a lot of the things we try to do through the TDM plan. So, you know, right now we require 2 spaces per unit in zoning, and then we go through all of this effort and expenses to try and get people to not actually use those cars, that we require them to have space for those cars, but we then try to make it so they don't use those cars through a whole menu of The more efficient way is to locate housing in areas where you don't need a car for everything. So exactly what we're doing here. Locating housing in village centers where you have walkable amenities, locating housing for transit, allowing smaller units, removing or reducing the number of parking spaces required. All of this is more effective than a whole menu of screens of paying people to take the T or providing your own shuttle or, you know, this or that. It just by the zoning alone, we're going a long way with TDM. So I think we'll see how the TDM policy develops and whether it makes sense to make an ordinance, whether it makes sense to apply it here ultimately. But just what we're doing through the zoning is really, I think, the most effective thing we can do.
Number 11, vibration control plan. We talk about it. It would be required as part of CMP, but then you talk about site plan review. So what's the difference?
There isn't one. I think so many of these things right now are required through another ordinance, yet they're put as a condition in the special permit. So all I'm saying is this will be part of a CMP requirement. However, if you want to reinforce that, as we do today with special permits, you could through site plan review as well.
But again, at site plan review, you can't refuse the project. So if they say, well, I can't meet that. I mean, what good is it in the site plan review? To me, it seems like the site plan review doesn't have teeth to force.
I mean, if you're already requiring it as part of the building permit, it's just like we're doing today with the special permit. We're just adding a condition that's already going to be applied. We add lots of conditions today for things that have to be done anyway. You
But
need
that
engineering
does-
to sign off.
But
It's
that's
redundant to sign off
Okay,
anyway.
it's just redundant.
It's redundant.
Okay. Okay, okay, and that was also part of the rodent and pest control and pest control. So I didn't understand, and maybe you can explain how this works for by right projects, since number 17, paying for police details. It's required as necessary for safety purposes where the construction is the result of a by right building permit or special permit. So the police chief reviews all the building permits and then he determines if they need a.
So the detail is when you're having to do something in the street, right? And you need police there to make sure it's safe. So you don't need a police detail just for what's happening on site. You need a police detail because you have a big truck that's blocking the lane, that's doing something, you're having a delivery. So in order to do that, there is a process through DPW and the police.
Okay. So number 18, the INI, so what I was trying to get at, and this one where I was asking for a 5-year look back, but maybe it's, 2 or 3 year look back. But you said, in here, there's result of INI, and also there's also some, some other money that comes in. So what's this other money and how much is it from other money would go, that would come in from these projects? So what has in the past, there's been additional money besides INI?
So for most projects, the larger projects, yes, there might be money above INI. Those are still going to need a special permit. For most projects, especially at the scale we're talking will be by right, it is the INI payment. When that formula was updated several years back, it jumped substantially. It's a pretty significant amount of money for most projects that's required for the INI payment. We do have an INI ordinance now that allows up to 75% of that money to go towards other things. That's the mitigation funds you typically see as part of a special permit. So the INI calculation sets that total amount. Engineering looks at it and says, either we need the whole money, whole amount for INI, or in most cases, they say we only need the 25%. And then there's 75% of that number is available for other infrastructure improvements. So that's usually where we get the money for pedestrian crossings, for upgraded, you know, intersection improvements, for some money goes towards park upgrades, things like that, is usually coming from that I&I at 75%. That doesn't change for by right projects.
And I agree with President Albright that we need to have a better process and what we're gonna do with that. The next one, again, it comes to site plan review, and you're stating a lot of things that are part of site plan review. Would be good to see, okay, these are all the items under site plan review, and see if we are missing anything. Like I said, this is not an all-inclusive list. This is just what is off the top of my head. One of the things about the shadow studies, I think from something from the planning is the built out or close to built out villages in that, and seeing what the shadow studies would be like. Would that be would we be able to do something like that?
No, we would not be able to model a build out scenario for the village centers with shadow studies.
And why? I know like Newtonville did a sort of one and stuff. yeah.
Right, and it wasn't totally correct. So as you know, what we did when we did do those sort of perspective views, that takes an incredible amount of time and expense. We don't have the money in our budget to do that for all of the village centers. We also don't have the time, if you would like to see something adopted by the MBTA communities deadline. You know, we are focused on a very small percentage of the city. We try to set those heights and those other controls, those setbacks, those step backs at the upper floors, those step backs or step downs adjacent to residential to ensure that they are compatible buildings. But we're not going to be able to analyze every shadow that.
Just a couple more quick things. One thing that, especially with the bigger ones, and it's interesting, Councillor Bowen brought up, is that the developers take the commercial street and zero it out. So if that's the case, they're not looking at any profit there. Then we require a certain percentage of it to be local, a local store of some sort. And we did something like that in Trio, you know, and it would be more for the bigger ones, you know, if they only have one or two, you know, storefronts, it wouldn't, but if they have more storefronts, that we would require something local, especially since they're not coming on the money. So I'd like to see more than just one, but that's something I would like to see put in.
I think, Councilor Bowman's hand up, but I think she was saying specifically for 100% affordable projects. That's where they don't count the ground floor retail. Not all projects.
Okay, 100%. We'll ask her when she does.
Something we can
Come
also
on.
speak to other developers about as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and if for your point for the large projects, you will still have the special permit. So similar to Trio, still have the ability to apply those sorts of conditions.
Yeah, but we're talking about possibly increasing where the special permit starts. So, you know, Santander right now is just over the threshold, but you know, if we say special permits start at a higher level, so I'd like to see something like that in there. Something we didn't discuss, which I'd like to discuss at some time and not necessarily today. We're talking about historically significant buildings and how to determine that in the village centers. And I'd like to see, and it's a discussion with the Newton Historic Commission, that they might get involved because I think they have the expertise to determine that instead of just the planning department or just the
Councilor,
councilors.
could we stick on the design standards and then have a little time at the end to raise other issues?
Okay, and then my last one, going through a few of the other towns and taking a look at what they're doing for the MBTA laws. And what Lexington is doing, which is interesting, is their side setback is determined by the lot frontage. And that could be possibly for BC1, because that's more, that's where people, you're gonna get the biggest complaints. So like, if it's under 50 feet, they have 7.5 feet side setback. It's between 50 and 75, it's 10. 75 to 100, it's 12. 100 or more, it's 15 feet side setback.
And we'll essentially end up with that because we have a max footprint, right? So if you're using FAR, your size of your building is growing as your lot gets bigger, ours isn't. So when you have a bigger lot, it's still the same footprint, so you will end up with larger setbacks.
Yeah, but right now we have, I think you decreased it for all of them to be 7.5 feet, and which is only in the MR districts and not the SR districts, but the way you have BC1, it's only 7.5, so it is decreased. And generally, you know, your SRs are bigger lots, so this makes more sense. So I think it's a good thing that they do. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Ryan. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Councilor Leary. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this was a great list. And I thought Council Wright's comments about having this organized in a way that we can sort of better explain and where what those layers is a good point. And definitely like to see that. Two things that I have been concerned about in the last year or two are rodents and vibrations. And I'm glad that they're going to be a central part of our CMP. Currently, the by right projects for rodent control are only required for the demolition of homes prior to the tear down. And if they don't find any rodents on it, then there's no plan in place. But what I've been seeing is that people are impacted by rodents near a construction site, near a tear down. I have one woman on Pearl Street who's trapped 19 rats in her basement across the street from a by right site, which was said there were no rodents there. And some kind of sketchy rodent control company sent it, there's no rodents here. So I just find that.
They all ran across.
They all I think and also the rodent control plan, I mean, it can't be in a, it has to be treated more holistically, you know what I'm saying, like where we have to have some kind of integrated pest management with these plans and realize that if we're going to control rodents on site, we have to make sure that there's no food sources nearby. It's another issue that we're having with the dumpsters. Let's see. There was a discussion about the trash and recycling disposal. So there was the Sustainable Material Management Commission recently did a residential recycling survey. Have you seen that yet? And the good news is, well, there's the trash, there's about 950 plus housing units that do not get serviced by the city. And about the recycling rate for those sites are significantly lower than those that do get serviced by the city. But guess what? We're going to capture that with the new private hauler ordinance that we approved at our last city council meeting. So I think that will help with that. So I just want to be there's a few things in here that I just want to make sure that they are captured either in the CMP and not necessarily in design standards. And again, we want to make sure that that they have some teeth. And also I just want to think we should look closely at the stormwater ordinance to make sure that there's nothing there that we have missed. Or that we could reconsider as we're looking more and more at by right developments. Actually, I just thought this was a really good list. That's really, the transportation, the TDM policy. You know, we've been I know, I remember Councilor Greenberg and I were working with that, with the city of Watertown, which, that's momentum. And we had it's very difficult to get that going. And as you said, you made the point more than once that, the way to reduce congestion is to reduce reliance on single vehicles and encourage more housing in small units, which I totally agree with. But if we were gonna, if there would be a place where it would be appropriate for a TDM policy and, clearly that new development on Medium Street is going to have to. But I think might want to consider coordinating that with maybe other communities or larger developments. Because they are generally expensive to run. And then with the vibration control plan, I just would like to make sure that the city has the expertise to better understand that, because I learned that it's quite technical. And so it's something that we might want to have to be reviewed by a third party that's not involved with the developer. So that's it for me.
All right, thank you very much. Councilor Princeton, do you want to add anything?
I think people have covered it pretty well. I think Councilor Baker's point is well taken, that you sort of look to the past, see what things we all agree should be in special permits, use that sort of as a menu. It's almost like automobiles, right? These safety features come out and it's like, that's great, okay, we all want that, and then they become standard. So, we're sort of moving to making these things as standard as part of the process. So I'm supportive of it. And I also want to thank Councilor Wright for bringing this list to our attention and raising the questions. I do think it was a helpful exercise.
Thank you. I wanted to add just one thing. I think this conversation has been terrific, and then I'll go online. We, a couple of meetings ago, talked about VC1 standards quite a bit, but design standards for VC1, are you considering something that came up over and over again, where we have so many different lot configurations in the VC1 proposed district, and I imagine the district is expanding, so we have contiguity. So on the large lots, there were a number of folks who said, in order to incentivize adaptive reuse or actually reuse and restoration, is 400 square feet enough? It probably isn't, especially on lots where you actually could achieve the number of units that we're trying to achieve. So for now, I just want to know, are you looking at a larger number? Are you looking at, a different set of metrics, or a set of metrics that is relative to the size of the lot, relative to the opportunity? Is that it? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
We don't have an answer just yet, but that is something we're working on and looking at. We've heard that from others as well, the building professionals group raised that issue as well. We think that's a very legitimate issue. The 400 square feet, that was sort of the minimum we thought you needed to add some egress recommendation. But I think it's a very good point that if we really want to incentivize the preservation, reuse of those buildings, which is not an inexpensive endeavor, that we need to allow more, the bare minimum for.
And the lot size
Really,
will
yeah.
Control that too, but what if, there's some really deep lots, say on Lincoln Street, and that's going to be a VC1, so we get some contiguity along there, for example, which would make a lot of sense because it goes right to the next T stop. There's a handful of lots where, that would make sense. You might not be able to have a separate building, but you might be able to have the addition, which would help to finance the restoration properly. Okay, enough said. Go ahead.
Just one comment, as we were talking about I thought of leaky laterals. Where
That all the time.
a number of years ago, Councilor Crossley and then Councilor Fuller did a lot of work with inspection with on INI. And we talked about on sale or on demo or on substantial renovation requiring that they be restored or repaired. That this, I don't think we ever got an ordinance, did we? Did we ever get an ordinance on that?
There's actually a requirement in engineering for new construction.
And substantial renovation.
For substantial renovation, yes, that, what we didn't, that you have to replace it if it fails. So, or if it's
We
failed.
didn't get inspection on sale.
What we didn't do, we didn't get an inspection at point of sale, correct? Did not get that, not do that.
How do we find out whether they did leaks or not? How do we
Well,
force
I
that?
think there's an assumption when you do a substantial renovation.
Yeah, we
It has to be TV inspected if you're doing new construction or renovation. And actually, engineering looks at how old the property is and other factors, and they'll determine from that that it needs to be replaced.
Yeah, so as long as it resides somewhere in the zoning code, fine.
Yeah, that would be outside zoning, but yes.
Yeah,
Right.
but we want to make sure that at least our villages don't have any leaky laterals.
Okay. Leaking laterals, I know, I know, right? Counselor Bowman, thank you for waiting.
Well, of course, thank you, Madam Chair. So 3 points, so 4 points. I've enjoyed this discussion. It's been very good. On bike parking, so I do believe that this is something that the bike and pedestrian master plan is going to provide a little bit of insight to this, not just where we should be parking in public spaces, but the importance of bike parking where people live and work, having safe, protected spaces for bikes is really incredibly important if you're going to rely on them as one of your primary modes of transportation. So I think in that regard, I think it's really important that we somehow work into this by right zoning, not just bike parking spaces, but that they be either in a bike room or sheltered, somehow just not just some loops that are stuck on the front of the building, but someplace where people could leave their expensive, cargo bikes and their bikes, for them to be safe and out of the weather. The EV charging standards. So of course, there is a whole EV task force that's been looking at this. I've been working pretty hard on this. I think you're familiar with what I've just sent to legal. I'm waiting to hear back from legal, sort of a final opinion, but their gut reaction on changing the EV charging standards was that given that it is now, the good news is EV charging standards are now required as part of the new stretch code, but the bad news is it's only EV charger ready and not actual chargers. That only becomes more of an issue, I think, when we're talking about rental situations versus ownership. So, we'll continue to discuss what our options are to sort of push on having at least some of those 20% that are required to have them be to be chargers and not just charger ready. And lastly, I don't know at what point, it was probably in the last discussion when we were talking about affordability. I had asked a question a few weeks back about VC1 and the possibility that the standards we have for the maximum footprint might make it impossible to build a fourplex, especially one that complies with MBTA zoning. So not to be answered tonight, but I'd love an answer on that, because if it has I think I recall that it was a 1,500 maximum square footprint in a VC1. And if we're going to have, if the units have to be at least 1,000 square feet, that would say to me, and then add in, you've got to put a staircase to the second floor. But even without a staircase, there's some magical, it doesn't work out. So I'd like us to make sure when we're thinking about fourplexes, I have heard from affordable housing developers that this is the format that is most likely to generate small affordable housing, so 4 units on a small lot. So I'm happy to continue to have that conversation with somebody offline from this, because I do recognize it's 9:45, but I think that's a really important thing to think about.
They don't have to be 1,000
Yeah.
square feet. Yeah.
That's the assumption in the model to.
Oh, the model that it would be, okay.
Yeah, it doesn't mean that they would have to be 1,000 square feet. You do get about 4,000 square feet, I believe, with that building type. And we do have a number of examples that we showed a few meetings back of existing buildings that are around or a little less or slightly more than that footprint that have 4 or more units. But yeah, you don't have to build 1,000 square foot units, so you could fit 4 units in it.
So it would be 4 units. You could have a 4-plex in a VC1 and have it count as 4 units under the model.
Correct.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. All right, thank you. That's all my comments.
Thank you, Counselor Bowman. So it is late, but if anyone has, as I said at the beginning, if anyone has another outstanding concern, question, something you want to make sure is getting covered in BC2, please come forward, and or we can just wait, and in 2 weeks or a little less than 2 weeks, we're going to have our chance to dig in and read through the second version of text and maps. So you guys aren't gonna sleep from that. So that's all right.
So, and we don't have to talk today, but I'd like to bring up a more discussion about historically significant buildings. And how determining that, we discussed that a month or 2 ago, but to go on. And
We'd love to add to that, and that we talked about a bonus for affordable housing, but we sort of once mentioned a bonus for preserving historic structure, but we sort of spit it away and said later. But it's gonna come up, so I feel like we should address it.
So how's the adaptive reuse section coming?
Yeah, so we're actually working that with the health department, right? Some of it a big piece of it comes down to what we do with parking. So a big incentive for, or a big disincentive for reusing buildings when you have new parking requirements that apply, not necessarily any space provided. So that is a big incentive for adaptive reuse that, could be applied hopefully more broadly, and just makes it easier overall to reuse existing buildings and change uses over time. But we are looking at how that adaptive reuse section would need to be written. But part of it is that the parking is a big piece of it.
So will we have a draft with version 2 of that section or paragraph?
Yes.
But so the MBTA Communities Act though requires that we have to have some parking, or at least in their calculations.
No, so the MBTA Communities Act actually wants us to
Eliminate.
get rid of,
Remove zoning barriers.
yes, remove zoning barriers, of which parking is the biggest one.
But when you do require parking, the formula requires the parking to be above ground.
So yes, it assumes when there is a parking requirement, it assumes surface parking.
Doesn't require it.
No, but it's still,
It is-
but would you reduce in our numbers that
Correct.
we
Yeah.
would.
Yeah,
Yes.
so by removing those barriers, such as parking, we know parking will still get built. But the model sort of rewards you by doing that, by making, those numbers end up being a good bit higher.
And we're jumping around,
Yeah.
we're talking about adaptive reuse,
Yeah.
and just to close maybe a loop. Reusing and renovating structures and adding units, we don't count those units for MBTA communities either. MBTA communities is capturing new construction.
Yeah, what can go on that
So
line?
a lot of different things we're trying to accomplish.
But if
here.
we're offering both options.
Yeah,
Then
we
we're
get to
counting.
count the other
Sure.
option, yeah.
Right.
Any additional units that are created onto, let's say as an addition, would count toward MBTA.
No, it's what the zoning would allow on a blank slate on that site. It's not what ultimately gets built or considering this exists and we add on to that. It's you had a blank slate, what would zoning allow? How many units?
So if we have a 10,000 square foot lot, there's an existing house, it's perfectly good shape. And we're trying to incentivize keeping it and restoring it, but adding, dividing it up and adding so that there's more units. That's just one option. But the other option is it gets torn down and becomes whatever fits on that lot, 3 or 4 units. MBTA Communities is counting second option. When they do their calculation. We're trying to incentivize the first option, but they ignore that.
Yeah, and there's like some houses that are 10,000 square feet, so you could have 10 units there, but we would only get credit for 4. So if they would tear it down, they would could only build maximum footprint would be 4.
We're trying to do a lot of different things at once and balancing that against the MBTA communities requirement.
Oh, go ahead, Council Baker.
I'm not sure where and how this comes up in the conversation, but there is a fiscal impact, obviously, of the construction of different units in the sense of how much revenue they're likely to produce compared to their cost of service. I think we need to have some way of first trying to understand that. When we've had individual projects, I know that they've done that analysis for a number of the big projects like Plan and Riverside. But part of the question that this is obviously going to raise is what does this do to our fiscal capacity, as well as our land use capacity? I just don't know where and how that conversation goes on. I think we need to understand it to at least explain it.
We can pull that research. I think there's a lot of good research out there about the benefits and the net positivity of this type of development through the Joint Center for Housing Studies and other resources that we could use, and obviously pulling from projects in Newton that have done that type of work.
The short answer is that it's positive. It's not positive.
Help me just understand.
A member of our community, Kathy Pillsbury, did send us a very interesting analysis by looking at projects that we've accomplished in the city and the relative contribution to the tax base, considering those things, not taking into account the sort of broader economic value of those projects. As we know, Trio and Austin Street went into Newtonville. The place got a lot livelier, and so you have the added effect of, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring more life into our village centers for their own sake, for our own sake. But I thought her analysis, and that was shared with everyone. It was emailed to all of us.
In response, Councilor Lucas asked a similar question.
That's right.
As meeting with the meeting before. And she did that. She sent us that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I don't know how else you would look at it, because the development that we're enabling will happen, some of it will happen over time. Over how much time? But I think to look generally at the kind of development that we're hoping to get, which is similar to the mixed projects you looked at, I think it's a really helpful point of view.
You're raising something that I think we talked about, and I just want to close the loop on that too, which is if we rezone these properties, individual properties, they become more developable, even though they may not be developed, right? So does that mean their property tax assessment goes up to reflect their development capacity?
No, I think we talked about this in a previous meeting. You confirmed it does not. You're not assessed on potential. You're assessed on what's existing.
That's surprising, because I remember at one point, the assessors reassessed the property next to the Grand Henry Homestead, the vacant lot, because it was buildable, and it became a very different And that's why we got all this started on the whole question of preserving that site. So I don't think that's all automatically true. Now, maybe I'm glad to be corrected, but use value, you know, taxing it as used, I think is sort of a custom in the city. And I don't know if that's ultimately what's going to happen. I'm
I
not
don't
sure.
think the assessing department has any plans to approach that differently. They do assess based on the existing structure, existing use, but there might be some overall increases in value. But they're not assessing on zoning potential.
So, yeah, but if lots start being sold and it gets sold for a lot more, that your property, if you're in that group, will go, your assessed value will go way up. So yes, it does, but not directly, indirectly. So some properties that would change.
I would like to know that a little more clearly, just so we clearly understand it. I think that's the
Also, I think there's a big difference between an undevelopable lot and a developable lot. Right, I understand your analogy you're making, but I think there's a big difference in the value of what's there, you know, have something that nothing can be.
I understand that distinction, but I'm just, at least my understanding is the general principle you test, you value property real estate as its highest and best use under current zoning. Right, and,
That's not what the assessing department says. So when you are doing an in some purposes, when you need to assess as part of like a sale or something like that, we do talk to appraisers or whatnot that are looking at what could be allowed. What our assessing department does, what taxes you're paying is based on what's existing. Now it is, I'm sure, taking in, there are a number of inputs that may change over time if you're seeing higher, although I'm not sure how much more property could sell for here. But you could see some of those inputs change, but they are assessing based on what's existing.
I hear you on.
I mean, you can talk to the assessing department. Me making- I have no.
If you're talking about commercial property, understanding they assess and value it on the basis of capitalization of income base. You know, say how much money is generated from the site and then turn it into a commercial valuation. But if you're talking about residential sales, it's a comparable sales method. So if the parcel is zone BC3 next to you and you're BC3 and it's sold for, you know, and it's exactly the same building and it sells because it's going to be developed and torn down. It sells for a high number. Does that mean the property that you're in automatically is going to be reassessed because it now is a comparable property? That's what I think Councilor Wright is talking about, and that's what I'm trying to understand, the kind of implications of what we're doing. Yeah, we may choose to do it anyway, but I just think we should go into it with an eye on the horizon.
So,
Okay.
thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us online, folks, and we need a motion to hold the item. Okay.
It's fast on the
Motion to
draw.
hold from Council Principal. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed or abstaining? No. So have a good night, everybody.
Thanks for coming.